second. Yeah. Hello, can you hear me well? Yeah. Thanks. So welcome to this session on data retention. You might wonder, why are we talking still now today about data retention again? Well, this is something we're going to get into. The title of the panel is not really, it's a bit alarming, but it's also optimistic, as you can see. I'll be the moderator today. As a disclaimer, I'm the assistant of one of the panelists who's late. So while he's away, I can still say what I want. So I'm Simeon Brouwer, assistant to MEP Patrick Breyer. With me, I have Plixavra Vogiatzoglou. I have, who is at the Center for IT and IP Law in Leuven as a doctoral researcher. We have Raf Jespers from Justice Lawyers, who's representing La Ligue des Droits Humains, the Belgian NGO, and La Liga van Mensenrechten, the Flemish pendant. And we'll have, if he manages to find a parking spot, MEP Patrick Breyer, representing the Pirates. And he works for the Greens IFA group more generally. You may have noticed that data retention is a topic that comes and goes. We talk about it at CPDP, at Freedom Not Fear, at Price Camp. It's been many years. There's been multiple panels, but also multiple Court of Justice cases, each with a slightly modified question to the court. So why are we here today? What has changed since the last time? You might wonder, maybe you know that there's not that much new compared to a year ago. Well, there's been at least one new law that has been passed, and there's a couple that have been stricken down. We'll get into this. Patrick just arrived, so it's perfect. We're going to start. Let me start with you, Plixavra. You presented a couple months ago your research at the Luis conference in Italy. It goes, it's about how the security objectives correspond to the, how the seriousness of the security objectives pursued by the data retention correspond and compared to the seriousness of the interference to fundamental rights. Can you tell us more about this research of yours? And I'll give you my...
Thank you very much also for the organizers for having me and for Simeon for the introduction. Indeed, you can also find a lot of this information I'll be discussing today on a presentation I gave on the KU Leuven website. So I would like to discuss today the judicial regulation of mass and data retention and some challenges that arise. I imagine as experts you probably have heard some of the things before, but I hope that we can engage into more discussion in relation to three specific challenges, as mentioned by Simeon, how the Court of Justice has developed this hierarchy whereby the more important the policy interest objective is, it must be proportionate to the seriousness of the interference incurred by fundamental rights to privacy and to data protection. So, according to the court, the most important security objective, it is capable of justifying the more serious interferences and the more processing operations are allowed. And on the top, we have the safeguarding of national security, which is the most important security objective. In the middle, we have the protection of public security and the fight against serious crime. And on the bottom, we have the fight against crime, which allows for the least intrusive and the non-serious interferences with privacy and data protection. So what the court considers on the top, national security it is capable of justifying what the court refers to as the more serious interferences, and those are, for instance, the preventive mass retention of metadata, electronic communications metadata, but also the real-time collection and automated analysis of metadata. In the middle, the fight against serious crime and the protection of public security. For that purpose, only serious interferences may be justified, and those can be incurred by, for example, mass retention of IP addresses and targeted metadata retention. And the fight against crime can only justify non-serious interferences, such as the mass retention of civil identity data. So we already know that the EU, the European Court, the European Judge, has allowed mass data surveillance. And I would like to focus on 3 challenges in relation to first the security objective, then first the seriousness of the interference, then the security objective, and then the distinction between mass and targeted. So first, how can we distinguish what the type of interference, whether it's serious or non-serious? To start with, data retention in itself, regardless of any harm or sensitive data being included, constitutes an interference. And that conclusion is even more justified vis-à-vis privacy when sensitive information is included. Then, the court has found that the processing of data which do not allow precise conclusions to be drawn about individuals leads to a non-serious interference. And that was, for example, in Ministerio Fiscal. The same conclusion, it is noteworthy to say that the same conclusions was drawn with regards to the processing of passenger name records data in the context of the EU-Canada international agreement, whereby the court had said at the time that the processing of these large amounts of data, despite the fact that they can reveal a lot of sensitive information and are subject to automated processing, does not constitute a serious interference. The exact opposite was now recently concluded with regards to passenger name records data processing in the context of the EU and as regards the PNR directive. And there the court said that the PNR data processing, because it is continuous, systematic and untargeted, it undoubtedly entails a serious interference. And a similar reasoning was also used in the Digital Rights Ireland ruling, whereby the court made mention of how this wide-ranging data retention creates this feeling of constant surveillance. So we can see that perhaps this element of constant and continuous surveillance is important for assessing seriousness of interferences. And finally, what the court considered as the more serious interference on the top of the hierarchy is to my knowledge, only being discussed in the context of national security. So the most decisive factor seems to be whether there is sensitive information and whether that information allows to draw specific conclusions about individuals' lives, private lives. The court is quite focused on privacy and often assess this seriousness of interference in a quite conjoint assessment. And here it is perhaps interesting to ask whether assessing the right to data protection alone and interferences with the right to data protection could be assessed independently, not only as a means to safeguard privacy, but also pursuing goals of safeguarding fundamental rights more broadly, as well as empowering individuals against power and informational asymmetries. So in this case, an interference should be serious and even more serious simply by the fact that these vast amounts of data being collected amplify quite significantly the power and informational asymmetries between the citizen and the government. Now, the second challenge I would like to discuss is how to distinguish between this first objective or the more serious objective of national security and the objective of protecting public security. The court considers that these two types of threats are distinguishable by their nature, seriousness, and the specific nature of circumstances. And mass data retention is allowed when there is a present or at least a foreseeable threat against national security, which is distinguishable by their threats to public security, which are, according to the court, general and permanent. However, if we see how in EU law and case law these two concepts are defined, very often a lot of the same terminology is used. And while national security is not defined in the law as such, the Court of Justice has given a sort of definition in La Quadrature du Net. And public security, it was initially kind of defined in case law regarding the fundamental freedoms of movement. And now you also can find definitions on public security within the Law Enforcement Data Protection Directive and the regulation on the free flow of data. And in those definitions, we see that both national and public security are defined by making references to the protection of fundamental interests of society, protecting essential services, the survival of the population, interstate relations, and even military interests. An area which is traditionally appointed to national security is now also used to describe public security. So, and adding to that, of course, is the thorny topic of terrorism, which is falling under both. And that has been explicitly recognized, for example, in La Quadrature du Net. And while terrorism is part of national security, on the other hand, in, for example, the PNR directive ruling that I mentioned earlier, there the court was more reluctant to accept that actual intelligence services will have access to this data because they also pursue this same objective. So the guidance from the court on how to differentiate these two types of threats might be a little bit limited, neglecting the definitional confusion, as well as how in practice security agencies are increasingly and more closely collaborating, further blurring the lines. Ultimately, the most decisive factor seems to be a temporal one between present and foreseeable and general and permanent. And in such a dynamic environment such as security, it might not be as clear and as easy to draw the lines there either. So, as invoking a different security purpose allows for mass or targeted data retention, the question inevitably arises whether member states will try to label more operations as protecting against foreseeable threats to national security in order to impose mass data retention. And finally, the third challenge I would like to bring forward relates to the issue on how to delineate between what constitutes mass data retention and targeted retention. According to the court, mass is general and indiscriminate, while targeted is a data retention measure that is targeted in relation to a specific time period, a geographic location, persons likely to be involved in any way to crime, or persons who could, for other reasons, contribute to the fight against crime. So, insofar as restricting retention to geographical area is concerned, there the court has further clarified that this can happen, for example, by restricting data retention to all the people within a location that is chosen because, for instance, of its vulnerability or high risk of crime, such as airports or maritime ports. So these criteria seem to neglect, first of all, how targeted, from a criminal procedural perspective, should be more linked or related to a reasonable suspicion, and should be more specific in relation to a specific threat or crime. And they also seem to neglect the reality of advanced algorithmic tools increasingly being used. The court has made a caveat that the effectiveness of modern investigation techniques should not lead to mass surveillance. So this seems to imply that we should find a balance between ensuring effectiveness of new tools and not leading to collection of data being mass. However, it might be difficult to draw lines on what is considered an objective link between the data to be collected as targeted and the fight against crime when we have automated and predictive analytics employed, which are notoriously not as objective as initially thought, and they are inherently looking for previously unknown threats, and their effectiveness actually depends on having more rather than less data. So that could potentially make the link between the threats and the broad amounts of data to be collected more easily established. And after all, data contributing to the fight against crime may be all the data that help to create and update assessment criteria, as is the case with the aforementioned PNR directive, whereby one of the purposes of processing all the passenger name records data of all passengers within Europe is exactly to create and update the pre-established models on the basis of which we can make risk assessments of passengers. So in this way, even if member states limit their practices on targeted data retention, that might still be not as targeted as the court might think. And to wrap this up, I would bring all this regulation that the court has built is built on the premise that data retention has a legal basis in a way in the e-privacy directive. And with the draft e-privacy regulation, further questions arise. First of all, because the current draft, for instance, excludes national security from its applicability, bringing a conflict potentially with the case law. And second, because actually the references to retentions have been deleted and there is only a general restriction clause. So to conclude, do we want to have the regulation of mass and targeted data retention by the court or by the EU? And if it's so, by the legislator? Should that happen through secondary law like the privacy that concerns the confidentiality of communications, or should we have a more specified framework? And in that regard, I think that perhaps a new dedicated instrument with a proper impact assessment, having sufficient empirical evidence on what are exactly the security needs between leaking specific data to specific types of crimes, and the harms incurred not only on privacy, but also vis-a-vis data protection as an empowering tool, and also taking into account, of course, other rights like fair trial and discrimination, then we could perhaps have a more clear regulation.
Thank you very much, Plixavra. I think a couple of things that you've said will be touched upon the next speakers as well, both about the targeting of the retention and about the new possible tools for the EU, as well as about the effectiveness, empirical evidence about the effectiveness and need for these tools to begin with. Before I continue, let me just, I started this panel very quick because we were getting slightly late. But I forgot, therefore, to remind you that this is live streamed and that if there are questions also from the online audience, these can be asked through the intermediary of Twitter or Mastodon. But since I'm sitting here and moderating this panel, I need someone from the audience to look, I need a volunteer, thank you, to look for any questions with the hashtag privacycam2023 and hashtag data retention. So those of you who are watching this online know that you can still interact with us and ask questions through Twitter or Mastodon with these hashtags. The audience is also invited, even though also those who are in person in the event, to ask questions. I will give the floor both at the end but also in between speakers. So if you have questions, please note them down or keep them somewhere because otherwise you might forget them. Happy to take them in between different speakers. Is there any question on what has been said right now before we move to the next? Was anything unclear, or does any specific point needs to get a bit more in depth? If not, we'll move on, but think of your questions ahead for the next ones, please. Amazing. So, Raf Jespers, you represent the Liga and the League. Yes. I assume you're going to speak about the Belgian data retention law that was adopted last August, and specifically about the topics of what is targeted in a general and indiscriminate manner. When does a data retention law that does something that is both targeted and indiscriminate find the balance? The floor is yours.
Okay, good afternoon. I hope that you understand what I want to say because my English is not so good. Okay, I'm the lawyer from the League for Human Rights, the Flemish and French League of Human Rights in Belgium. We have two human rights leagues. And in Belgium, there are at this moment 3 data retention laws. The first was from 2000. I give you a short history to follow the discussion. The first law, Belgian law, data retention law, was from 2013, and the Belgian Constitutional Court annulled this law in 2016, first law. Second law was from 2015, and the Constitutional Court annulled this law in 2021. They annulled the second law after an interruption by the European Court of Human Rights to put so-called prejudicial questions, preliminary questions. We were 2 days in the very beautiful hall of the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. You must go there when you want to see the real work of the European Court of Justice. We were there 2 days to discuss the questions not only from the Belgian Constitutional Court, but also France and the United Kingdom, but in the same procedure, also prejudicial questions to the European Court. It's remarkable that in this procedure in Luxembourg, 15 European countries do an intervention. Normally, when you go to the European Court of Justice, there are 3, 4, 5 European countries who come in, but in this case, there are 15 countries present, and also the European Commission, that underline the importance of the discussion that was happened in September 2019 by the European Court of Justice. The European Court of Justice made at that moment a so-called judgment, la quadrature du net. It's because it was the French party who was the first party, but there was also a party of Great Britain, and from Belgium, we were there with the League for Human Rights, with the barreau from the lawyers, and with some other persons. I come back on la quadrature du net because it's a very important decision. Then in 20 July of this year, the Belgian Parliament voted the third new data retention. I say anti, but data retention law. And we have time just at 6 February to make appeal by the Belgian Constitutional Court. And we are at this moment, not I alone, but also 2 other lawyers, we are preparing the appeal by the Belgian Constitutional Court for the 3rd time. We go there. We hope to win it, but I will give you some continue about the 3rd Belgian law. That's the first part of the history, the Belgian situation. The second part of the history, that's what's happened by the European Court of Justice, because it's very important, because my opinion is that the European Court of Justice always take a good position in this question. Also when the pressure of many European countries was very high. In the discussion when we were in Luxembourg, the representative of Ireland say, when you don't follow our position, you will have problems with your court. Literally, he say that literally. The pressure, the intimidation of the court was very, very high. The court make the first decision about the data retention was in 2014. The basic law for the e-privacy directive is from 2002. 2002, then, because at that moment, the European Parliament and others realized that they have to do something about the communication, the e-communication, because it was coming up, it was happened more and more that people did communication by digital elements. First decision of the European Court, digital rights, 2014. Second judgment, Tele 2 Sferige, from 2016. And then we have the Quadrature du Net from 2020. And it's very important, also after la Quadrature du Net, there were two other procedures by the European Court about the same discussion. Also, the discussion about the German law. Because there was a similar German law like the Belgian law, but they wait to take a decision about the German law. After that, they take a decision about the Belgian, French, and law of the United Kingdom. There was an important decision with the name Commissioner of Anne Garda Síochána, I think it's from Ireland, in April, 5 April 2022, last year, very recent. And the most recent decision, judgment of the European Court of Justice was from 20 September, 3-4 months ago, about the German law. The name of that decision is SpaceNet. That's the current name to speak about this decision. 20 September 2022. That means that in this decision of SpaceNet, the European Court bring all their statements together. It's the basic to discuss at this moment, for instance, the third Belgian data retention law. What did they say in the decision of Quadrature du Net and also later in the decision of SpaceNet? You have to know that the central discussion is about Article 15.1 of the e-privacy directive. And this article was also central in the discussion in Luxembourg. And this article says, that's a European directive, that there can be restriction from privacy when it's necessary, appropriate, and proportionate measure within a democratic society to safeguard national security, defense, public security, and the prevention, investigation, detection, and prosecution of criminal offenses or of unauthorized use of the electronic communication system. What's important is the word in a democratic society. Many people forget it, but they think, yeah, it's about discussion, proportionality, and necessity, also that. But the fundamental political discussion is how far can we go in a democratic society to stop and to survive the communication of the people. That's a fundamental discussion. People say, yeah, but look to China, look to Russia, look to the United States. No, that's not the discussion. In Europe, the discussion is how far will Europe go and Belgium go to stay a democratic society. How far will we go? Okay, what did Quadrature du Net say? There's the charter, the directive, Article 15.1, and the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, Article 7 and 8, 7 privacy, 8 privacy on communication, from the Charter of the European Human Rights. They oppose general and undifferentiated retention on a preventive base of traffic and location of data. That's the central point of view of the European Court of Justice. There are
Just with a view of time, since the background might be already known by some or perhaps most of the audience, could you go a bit into the Belgian analysis, if
To the
possible?
Belgian law.
That might be. I know you're giving the framework for understanding what's happening in Belgium, but just with a view of time, because we.
Okay, but the question is, when you discuss the Belgian law, you have to know what was the position of the European Court of Justice. But okay, you can find my expose on the website of this camp, privacy camp. I will be very short because I have 15 minutes to explain this very complicated question. Okay, the Belgian law. What did they do now with the new Belgian law? In Belgium, there is some men say when men doet something again and again and again, een ezel stoot zich geen twee keer aan dezelfde steen. It's not a translation in English. It seems to be in English, a fox is not caught twice in the same snare. And when I see to the third Belgian law, but also to the second one is worse than the first one, and the third one is still worse than the second one. They do the opposite of what the law, the Belgian Constitutional Court and the European Court of Justice, what they say. What is worse? You have to make distinction between storing of data, retaining of data on one side, and the access to data. That are two different elements. About the storing of data, the new Belgian law make a difference between storing in geographical zones, and the European Court say you can do that, storing in geographical zones, but under many important conditions, not like that. Belgian law, third Belgian law, say that there must be storing in 5 different geographical zones. First are the judicial districts and police districts with a certain number of crimes per 1,000 inhabitants on average over the past 3 years. That means that when there are 3 crimes on 1,000 persons in certain judicial districts or police districts, they can order the operators to collect the data from the people. That's 3 per 1,000, that's 0.3%. 0.3%. It's very low. How will they control it? They will control it by the general data bank from the police. But in this data bank, everything comes in this data bank. Yeah? That's not made for this purpose. And in my opinion is that they never can do it on a good way. Second, the geographical zone, or the zones or entire territory determined by the coordinating body for threats analysis. In Belgium is the name OCAT. In case of threat level 3, and then they can do a general and undifferentiated detention. I repeat, the Luxembourg accepted, but also under very strict conditions. And these conditions are not in the Belgian law. Level 3 from the threat in Belgium is not the highest level. The highest level is level 4. And there is an important difference between the third level and the fourth level. I think that maybe only in the fourth level they can maybe do an application of this question. Third zone, the areas particularly exposed to threats to national security and serious crime. What are these areas? There are 19 different locations or areas. For instance, all the metros, all the prisons, all the arms dealers and shooting rangers, the municipalities with critical network, central and provisional data center building, and so on. 19 different places who also called a threat, can be a threat to national security and serious crime. 19. Fourth zone, the zone who may pose serious threats to vital interests of the country or essential population needs. What are these zones? All the neutral zones, the parliament and all what's in that position, all the motorways and the parking of the motorways. You know, Belgium is a very small country. You have everywhere motorways. All the town halls, the royal palace, okay, the royal domains, the constitutional court, and so on. And also the border municipalities. Dus all the border municipalities from this small country can be seen as a zone to collect the data. The last zone are the potentially seriously threatening the interest of international institutions established on national territory. What is it? The European Union, the Parliament, all the zone, Schuman Place, and so on. The NATO, the European Economic Area, the UN institutions in Belgium, and so on. Important is that this is in the law, but the law also says for the 5 zones that the government, by royal decree, can make them broader. They are still very, very broad. When you look to a second important point is that they say it depends also from the perimeter. How long will you go with this zone? There is no perimeter in the law. The law says it's a royal decree who can decide how long the perimeter will be. That can be 1 kilometer, that can be 20 kilometers. That makes a great difference. There is in the law not a minimum or a maximum from the perimeter that they have to develop. Then that's are the geographic zones. Then very short, second point, what kind of data must the operators collect? When you in the discussion, you can give me an example to see if this is in the data. I think that everything you can think about what operator can collect is in this data. It's more than 40 different data that they have to collect. Traffic data, general data, data about individual persons, and the law, the European law or European Court of Justice say you can collect, storage, do from IP addresses and identification addresses, but not more, in fact, not very much more than that. And when you do this, you can do it under special conditions. For instance, when that can be a problem for the threats against children, the pornography against children and things like that. There are very exact conditions in the decisions of the European Court. And then the third point, first zone, second, what the operators have to collect. Third point is the access. Which authorities can have access to the data from the operators? I I know the first law, I know the second law, and I know the third law. In the first law, there were 4 authorities who can have access. In the second law, there were 6 authorities who can have access. I ask you how many authorities are now in the third law? 10. 10 different authorities who can have access under certain conditions, okay, but who can potentially have access to these data. What's a little bit normal, that are the intelligence and security services, that are the competent authorities to follow administrative or judicial authorities competent to prevent, investigate, detect, prosecute serious crime. Okay, you can discuss about it. But also administrative or judicial authorities competent prevention, investigation, detection, prosecution, criminal offense, not serious crime. It's so in the law. And in fact, the discussion is serious crime. That's the only possibility to collect data, to have access to data. It's literally in the new Belgian law that also administrative and judicial authorities can have access for criminal offense, not serious crime. And some other 7 others also. Voilà, I can stop here. I will finish with one citation of the Belgian Protection Authority, the Privacy Commission. They look to this law and they give an advice about the project of the law. But between the real law and the project, there was not so many difference. What did the Belgian authorities say? However, and also the Belgian Constitutional Court say that, however, it should be noted that the preliminary draft law does not really entail the change of perspective as required by the jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice and the Constitutional Court. In its opinion, the authority notes that the preliminary draft law intends to impose new measures for retention of traffic and location data, which could lead to de facto reintroduction of generalized and indiscriminate data retention obligations, while at the same time increasing the possibilities for access until such data is further expanded. That's, normally, when you look at that, you stop with it. You stop with this law. And to finish, the same authority, it is therefore crucial to ensure that the draft law does not reintroduce a de jure or de facto generalized obligation to retain the traffic or location data of all or too many of the users of electronic communications in Belgium. Voilà, I finished with that because it gives a very good summary of the problem who has happened at this moment with the third law in Belgium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raf. This was very good to hear. So we have very clear issues that we need answers to in terms of what is serious crime, where does the data need to come from, can it be targeted while de facto reinstating mass surveillance. All these we'd like to have the audience ask more specific or in-depth question about. So if you have any, feel free to ask them now. Otherwise, keep them for later. But happy to have them now. You touched also on a couple points that Patrick, I believe, will go into. For example, what the dynamics are in terms of pressure, what the direction taken is. You mentioned IP addresses being retained, etc. Patrick, I believe you're going to speak about the situation in Germany in the SpaceNet case, but also the alternatives. So I want to ask you, why are we still here today, given there have been so many cases at the Court of Justice and other quotes as well. Has everything not been said? Why is there so much pressure from a legal but also political point of view, since you are both an MEP and a judge, for this mass surveillance in, can we say, all member states?
Not quite all, but nearly all. I'm first of all happy to be having this panel on data retention, and that so many of you are interested in the topic, because it's an old topic, but also one where civil society has been really successful in pushing back against this. The Court of Justice annulled the European directive on data retention and really set red lines to this type of mass surveillance. So it is so important that we keep fighting and defending it, and thank you for all your work in doing so, also in Belgium. Now, as to the situation in Germany, we also have a history of a first data retention law, 2009, that was annulled by the Constitutional Court. In 2015, another data retention law came into force, but administrative courts decided soon after this is in plain violation of the case law of the European Court of Justice, and they suspended this law. And that's basically the legal situation we are at. In September of last year, as we've heard, the Court of Justice annulled or basically declared the German legislation in violation of fundamental rights of the EU Charta, and the main reason it gave was that this data could reveal habits of everyday life, permanent or temporary places of residence, daily or other movements, the activities carried out, the social relationship of those persons, and the social environment frequented by them. So the court understands very well just how sensitive this data is. But as has been said previously, it no longer applied these principles to the indiscriminate and general retention of IP addresses, which is a huge problem because these IP addresses allow for tracing your activity on the internet. It's like fingerprints that you are leaving on whichever websites you visit. They usually keep exact logs of your activity, even if you're not signed in. They will retain logs of your IP address and what exactly you were reading or posting online. And the fact that this is being treated differently by the court is a huge problem. The court also allowed for a so-called quick freeze procedure, which would then be used to preserve data on a case-by-case basis that could be needed to prosecute serious crime. In Germany, it then ensued a fierce debate within the government, which consists of liberals and Greens that have always opposed general data retention, but also social democrats that have actually enacted the law that was subject to the judicial review. And so in October of last year, the German Minister of Justice, a liberal, proposed a law that would replace the current data retention regime altogether by a quick freeze regime, and notably not using the opportunity for a general and indiscriminate IP retention. And the quick freeze regime that they propose would mean that at the first step it would generally require a court order, or in urgent cases an order by a judicial authority, the prosecutor, to preserve certain data of specific data. And in the second phase, another order would be required to actually access the retained data if needed for a specific investigation. And this quick freeze procedure, which is targeted, it is certainly a much better alternative because it's on a case-by-case basis. It doesn't place a general suspicion on the entire population. So this is the right way to go. But I think the scope is too wide because the proposal doesn't provide clearly how restricted these freeze orders would be. So it's worded so vaguely that you could basically have them very general and say, in order to investigate a certain a suspect, we basically need to preserve every data because everything could be relevant. And that is a great risk in the current wording of the proposal. But anyway, there is a deadlock in government because the other side, the Minister of the Interior, who's a Social Democrat, keeps calling for a general retention of IP records of the entire population and will not agree to anything less. And what they are mostly arguing with is child protection. However, I don't see that a general IP data retention would actually improve the situation when it comes to prosecuting a child sexual exploitation, and I will provide you with some arguments. First of all, we know, because of a parliamentary question, that Germany fails to trace only 3% of NECMEC reports of alleged child pornography, even though there is no general IP data retention in place at current. Only 3% of reports cannot be retraced. They're just very fast, and usually they can retrace IP addresses within the few days that the providers will keep them for business purposes anyway. Furthermore, Germany anyway is able to prosecute more than 90% of all CSAM investigations without blanket IP data retention being in force. And also research by the European Parliament's Research Service that I commissioned found that throughout the European Union there is no statistically significant impact on crime or crime clearance rates when comparing those countries with IP data retention in place to those countries that do not have such a regime. And also we can see that in EU countries that have IP data retention in place, the crime clearance rate is also at present no higher than in other countries. So that's why I think that there is a lack of evidence that this actually significantly contributes to prosecuting these types of crime. Governments still tend to push for it, and we can see at EU level where there is indeed a discussion on reintroducing a new European instrument on data retention, that the greatest consensus among national governments is on mandating IP data retention, which is a great risk, because basically even in those countries where the constitutional courts or the parliaments have decided against it, they would be forced by union law to reintroduce it, and that would in the end make every online activity traceable. It would not affect criminals because they can easily hide between anonymization services. Data retention is ineffective for the covert investigations that are needed, for example, to prosecute child porn rings that usually use self-hosted forums and encrypted archives. Data retention cannot be used in that area, but it takes very targeted investigations. So what we need to talk about, and what I think is the greatest threat to fundamental rights, is the lack of discussion on real solutions and alternatives that are not as easy as a piece of legislation that Parliament can simply decide. So what kind of alternatives are there if we want to protect children? And we all want to do that. Let me just name a few that I've noted down here. What about an emergency number for children, or if somebody knows that some children is in danger? What about well-equipped counseling centers? They keep complaining that they are suffering from a lack of funding. What about anonymous contact points also for perpetrators who seek help? There is therapy on offer, but not enough places for pedophiles who want to receive therapy. What about public education campaigns, mandatory child protection programs in schools, sport clubs, churches? All these are places where child sexual abuse often typically takes place. Trained child protection officers, police units that are specialized and trained in processing these crimes. If you distribute the prosecution to local police officers, they often don't know how to deal with it professionally. They don't know how to identify victims. They don't know what to prioritize. That is a problem we are seeing with law enforcement at present. What about online police patrols or login traps that will be able to preserve the IP address of a suspect the next time they log in? That usually works for services that require a login without IP data retention in place. So there are so many alternatives that need to be thought of, and that would be so much more effective, but not as easy to put in place. So we certainly need more dialogue between child protection experts and fundamental rights experts. And we need to learn from experiences such as the horrific case in Germany, in Lütke, where children suffered 20 years of abuse. And the report on this actually concluded that this was due to a failure of authorities and a lack of investigations. And the same is the case often when it comes to abuse within church authorities. No more surveillance is needed for that. So let me close with two remarks. The first is a very recent and pending case on data retention we still have with the European Court of Justice is the Hadopi case, which is about what are the conditions for accessing IP data retention. The Court of Justice said you can retain it indiscriminately, but you can use it only for prosecuting serious crime. And now the Advocate General in this Hadopi case actually proposes to drop this requirement and allow to access your generally retained IP addresses even for prosecuting any crime, including copyright law, which is of course a huge expansion of purposes and would result in many more accesses to retrace your internet activity. And finally, a remark on what Raf described and how the governments deal with this case law, and Belgium is just one example of many similar ones. We really have a crisis of the rule of law in the EU. If you see how they deal with this case law on data retention, how they show contempt for it, how they try to circumvent it, to use all sorts of tricks, but sometimes openly disregard it, or even make laws that are worse than the ones that have been annulled. And the governments even put pressure on the courts, as you described it, to some effect actually. The court starts to introduce exceptions. But the EU Commission is completely standing idly by. It would be their job to enforce the case law on the e-privacy directive, and not a single enforcement procedure has been brought forward because the responsible commissioner, Interior Commissioner Johansson, is herself in favor of data retention. And so this is really a crisis of the rule of law. The EU keeps saying that Hungary and Poland have problems there, but in fact, when it comes to data retention, this is a crisis nearly throughout the EU, where governments are not willing to follow the rulings and to protect our fundamental rights. And that's why it's important that we stand up for our fundamental rights, that we reject any kind of general data retention which would affect 450 million EU citizens, place them under a general suspicion. Mass surveillance is the opposite of what European values embody, and you already mentioned the democratic society. What does it take to have a democratic society? And the threat we are seeing is the ignorance for finding real solutions. We need to work on alternatives, and we need to engage experts in doing that. And that's the positive outlook that I have, that it is possible, and we have an opportunity to convince the policymakers of better approaches.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you very much. This is at the same time bleak and also optimistic. I mean, hopeful looking. What's really good is that you provide alternatives, I think, and that you don't come with just, we don't want this, therefore it's out and we don't want discussion even. Does the audience have ideas about other alternatives that have not been mentioned, for example? Or before we move on to specific questions other than this, is anyone aware of alternatives that exist and have not been put on the table? If not, we'll move on to the questions. I think there was a question from online.
Just from Twitter, Nicolas Lapin, was if panelists can address what is the role of Europol to gather and process personal or communication data. That's the question.
Can you keep the microphone and give it to anyone who has questions following this? In the meantime, while we answer this question, you may think of your own questions if you have any doubts or any unclarity. Who wants to take this question on the role of Europol in gathering data? Patrick?
Yes, maybe just a quick information. For the first part, Europol stores all the data that they receive from member states. So it turns out, and there is a procedure pending with the European Data Protection Supervisor, that they are storing masses of data and also bulk data on millions of citizens, which the European Data Protection Supervisor says is illegal, but Europol refuses to delete. And they have now gone to court against the revised Europol regulation and mandate, which seeks to legalize this bulk storage of data on citizens. Some have said that what Europol is storing goes beyond what the NSA is storing, and this is really worrying. And for the other part, with the new Europol reform, Europol has received the power to directly request data from private companies. So they can ask for data. However, the companies are not required to hand it over, and maybe data privacy law may prevent them from serving those requests. We don't know at this time how often they use these new powers. We don't know whether companies will agree to handing over data, but there is a mandate.
Thank you, Patrick. Is there any other question right now? Otherwise, I may have questions for the panelists myself, or I may allow them to go into greater depths about things that have been mentioned and that would benefit from having more details. I'll give you 30 seconds without saying anything so that those of you who are brave enough can raise their hand. Oh.
Hi, Patrick Williams from Manchester Met University. Everyone on the panel's made reference to the problem of crime, definitions of crime. And I think the final point you were making, Patrick, around the fact that the vast majority of child abuse will take place in the home and in the family, means that any response to it is not really going to get to those issues. So I'm wondering to what extent that could be a valuable lens strategy through which to try and disrupt arguments for mass retention, given that crime in and of itself is really problematic and vague and isn't an absolute and objective fact of reality.
I think this question was directed to all of you equally, but if I'm not wrong, so if anyone wants to take it.
I think indeed it's a very interesting lens, and we do have a problem of definitions because, for instance, serious crime is not actually defined in the EU, and we have a lot of different instruments having their own definitions, which might depend on how many years of imprisonment is at risk. And I have also seen an empirical research on what actually the citizens consider to be serious crimes might not correspond to what the EU thinks it's serious crime. So for sure, I completely agree with you that the lens of looking into the causes of crime, the social and socioeconomical causes of crime, and how can we address them in the root rather than these mass data surveillance instruments. But we can see that this is not happening also with new technologies which are being developed or under development, and whereby it's more about looking for patterns of suspicious behavior that actually doesn't have any causal link to the sources of crime, but only looks into correlations between types of behaviors and criminal acts. So yes, I think we should refocus precisely as you mentioned, what are we looking for exactly, and what do we want to solve? Thank you.
Yeah, when I understand your question, this question about what's crime, what's serious crime, and what can you do against that, and what can you do with this kind of laws against serious crime? In the Belgian law, also in the third law, they give a reference to what is so-called as serious crime, that are 43 crimes for who not the prosecutor, but the onderzoeksrechter, the special person who can do these kind of interventions is competent. But that's a list of 43 crimes who are not really serious crimes. Serious crimes, what is that? Terrorism, drug traffic and things like that. That can be that, or things about against children and things. That means my position is that when you make these kind of laws, you have to give your own definition of serious crimes. They don't do that. They make reference to general position in the Belgian criminal law. Second point, and Patrick knows it better than me, they make a report to see if these kind of laws have any influence in the solution of crimes. You can give better the answer, but mostly it's not any proof about that. And in Belgium, there was the president of the High Court in Antwerp, who make his mercurial, that is the speech he gave by the beginning of the year, the juridical year, and he speak also about these kind of laws, and he say, what's the experience in Belgium about the period that there was a law and there was not a law? Because the first law was working, annullated, period of no law, second law, working, period of no law, and so on. He said, did you have any proof that in this period it was an element to give solutions to the crimes? And his conclusion is there is not any statistic. Not any statistic in Belgium. They don't know it. And that's not serious when you have these discussions in the parliament that are things that you have to know. You must know objective elements to make these kind of definitions. Third and last point, there is a problem. You maybe in Belgium you have the sky question. Maybe, I don't know if you know the sky question, but in France they find the description of the sky telephones, and they were at this moment, I think, based on the description of what's in the sky telephones were used by criminals in the drug traffic scene. And at this moment, there are in the prison in Antwerp about 150 people who were in prison based on that kind of description. Okay, it's a discussion, because the lawyers who defend this case by the tribunals, they say, yeah, but there is a problem with the Belgian data, with the e-privacy directive and so on. But the Belgian courts reject this opposition. But okay, in this kind of files, you see that it can bring some elements to solution of the crimes. That's all what I say about it.
Patrick, do you want to add something on this question of serious crime? Perhaps on the question of should we have an EU-wide notion of EU crime? Perhaps because I hear that in the, I think, Media Freedom Act, there might be a mention in the council documents of what a serious crime is. Regardless of whether there is or not, is it something that we should look into?
I'm afraid that if we had an EU definition, they would use that as an opportunity to introduce data retention, and also every member state would add their crimes to it, and we would end up with a catalog that's even larger than 43 types of crime. So I can't say I support that. But I fully agree with what Raf said on if the court says you can do data retention for national security, you can do data retention to target areas of you know, specific risks, then I wonder, what about any evidence that data retention specifically is strictly necessary to prevent threats to national security, to prevent terrorist attacks, to protect the court buildings and European Parliament? Has retained data ever been needed for these purposes? So they just set out purposes, but they don't specifically request evidence that this is strictly necessary to attain those aims. And I can only say that when it comes to France, they have a general data retention regime just in Belgium based on a permanent threat to national security. But they had data retention in place when any of the terrorist attacks that happened in France had happened. And I've not heard a single case where this would have helped to prevent these attacks. So I don't see the evidence that data retention is actually a useful tool to counter these threats. And that's something which I think the case law and the court needs to look into more, because a general requirement of proportionality is always, is something strictly necessary to attain the aim that you aim for?
That was always a discussion, eh? Is it necessary in a democratic society? The European Court of Justice also was confronted with this discussion, and they say in the SpaceNet judgment, Article 96, because that was also an argument in Belgium. Eh? The prosecutors and so on, they say, yeah, we need it for criminal to fight against the serious crime. The court say, European court say, in that regard, it must be observed in the first place that the effectiveness of criminal proceedings generally depends not on a single means, not on a single means of investigation, but on all means of investigation available to the competent national authorities for those purposes. That means they have also in Belgium, but in all the countries, they have other means to do the prosecution of crime. But okay, it's a discussion.
Thank you very much. We are reaching the end of the panel, so if anyone has a question pending, ask it now, otherwise we'll move on with concluding remarks. I'll give you 10 seconds. We move on. Therefore, closing remarks. I think the message that this panel gives is that it's intended for civil society, but also for Commission and governments, is that we are critical of what's being made, of the steps that are being taken. We are aware of what is being made and taken, and that we are not tired. We're going to fight this fight. I hear that you are going to appeal the Belgian proposal. Therefore, I want you to conclude and reflect on perhaps what is worse, the impact of crime when we don't have data retention, if it were effective, or the impact of having annulled again and again the data retention laws. So what is worse? Having crime that is not tackled through data retention, or having crime that was supposed to be tackled, but because we annul the data retention laws over and over, they are not able to be pursued in court. If we have to cancel these Skype cases, for example. And what is the most important threat also in the forthcoming years in terms of data retention? Plixavra?
Thank you. I agree with everything already said, that we don't really have any information as to whether crime is actually not being solved when we don't have data retention, or it's more solved when we do have data retention schemes. And let's not forget that data are retained for business purposes in any case for a period of time. So it's not like data are immediately gone forever. So with regards to the first part, I think we have already established we definitely need a lot more empirical information on what types of data are actually necessary and effective in contributing to specific types of crimes. With regards to the future, looking ahead, yes, as I mentioned, I think that this should be more specifically regulated, because the Court of Justice is also bound by the preliminary questions every time. It keeps on repeating, it's a case law, it keeps on being restricted in specific areas, and I'm not sure we can go much further only with case law. And knowing that the Data Retention Directive was annulled, perhaps a new legislative initiative would be a lot more careful in the impact assessment that it's mandated to have in order to pass. So that would be my suggestion or thought for the future.
Yeah, when they invite us for this discussion, they say, can you prepare what challenges you see for the future? I have two challenges. First, that we win the case against the third Belgian law, because you can discuss many things, but it's a concrete question to stop these kind of laws. And it's not evident to win it, but that's the first point. We will do everything for that, but it's not alone the lawyers who have to do their work, but I think everyone who is interested in privacy and democracy must support these kind of procedures, because we know that also a little bit of pressure of outside on the courts can be a little help for these kind of procedures. That's the first point. And also what we need for the League for Human Rights is money. We have not so much money to do these kind of procedures. It should be very good when there is a European funds for that in which we can collect money. And I think there are in Belgium, but also in Europe, many people who want to give €100 for this kind of procedures and this kind of fight. That's my first wish. And second wish is that I write my book Be Broadly in Europe in 2010. And then I say, at that moment, climate change was coming up. But I also, and it's very important, but I also say private change is coming up. But you don't see it, you don't feel it. You feel it only when there are accidents and things like that. And it's not easy to make a popular item from privacy. I know it. It's not like climate. You feel it when the rain is coming too much and so on. But for privacy, it's another. It's like atomic that you don't feel. It's that problem. That means that it should be good when they're on European level. There's some coordination, collaboration between all the people who are involved in this kind of discussions and this kind of struggle. I think we must need a kind of European. There are many different society, NGO's who make these kind of things, Quadrature du Net in France and others. But and maybe that's to you that I do this demand to try to coordinate on a European level the struggle to defend privacy, because there is climate change, but there is also private change. And we have to do with all the people who are concerned about that. We have to do something. It's really what you say. It's linked also with the time period. The rule of law, it's not only in this question that the rule of law is under pressure. It's in many other discussions that we as lawyers, not only on the Belgian level, but also on the European level, also the court in Strasbourg, they are under pressure. And from politicians who say we reject the judgments of the higher courts. Okay, that's my second wish to do a European struggle for the privacy.
Thank you, Raf. Can you give your microphone to Patrick? Sorry, there's a fourth one even.
If you want to raise funds, Raf, I'm happy to support and also to distribute the call for funding. As for how does it affect crime, I don't have a bad conscience in fighting data retention, because I know that the crime clearance rate is not influenced by whether there is a data regime in place or not. We can witness it in Germany, that there was no effect whatsoever when the law was no longer applied. And so I'm not worried at all. Certainly there will be one case or the other that investigators can specifically point to here. It would have helped us here. It may have prevented an investigation. But there are also counterproductive effects of data retention. For example, many more people use anonymization service if there is a data retention scheme in place. That is what polls have found in Germany, and so it can actually be harmful to criminal investigations and basically push crime to places that cannot be investigated even in a targeted manner. And finally, when it comes to the future and the outlook, I just want to say that if ever the EU Commission considers to propose legislation to bring back data retention at EU level, they can meet the fiercest resistance of the European Parliament, as can already be witnessed in the current discussions on the e-privacy regulation, where Council is trying to bring in data retention. We are totally refusing that and would rather give up the entire legislation than agree to that. And so I can only warn the Commission not to try to bring this instrument back, be it with regard to IP addresses or otherwise. They've totally failed in court with the data retention directive, and we should find alternatives.
Thank you. On these powerful words, let's close the panel. Thank you very much for your attention.